And for more on this, let's speak now to Aurel Braun. He's Professor of International Relations at the University of Toronto and is an associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Professor Braun, very good to have you back on the show. Let's start with this ceasefire. Was it really one at all over that 30-hour, stated duration?
It does not appear that there was a real ceasefire, but we need to understand the politics of this. Mr. Putin basically has been saying no to the American proposals. Let us recall that one of the proposals put forth by the United States was to be a 30-day ceasefire on both sides to go into effect as quickly as possible, and the Americans were looking for a yes or no answer. Essentially, Mr. Putin said no, but he tries to create the impression of yes. And so this 30-day so-called ceasefire was an attempt to massage the message, to somehow assuage Mr. Trump, to say that he is not being confronted by the Russians, that the Russians tried to cooperate, whereas in reality, they've been saying no repeatedly. And sadly, the history of ceasefires that Russia has entered into is not a happy one. It is very difficult to find any ceasefire that Russia had agreed to, which they had not subsequently violated.
So, Professor, then how realistically optimistic are you that this could sort of evolve into something more meaningful this week, as Mr. Trump was asking the two sides?
It's difficult to see how there could be real peace because Mr. Putin has not given up on his maximalist demands. He wants to see the government of Ukraine replaced, meaning that it would be a decapitation of that government. He wants to see NATO change its mode of operating in Eastern Europe. And so concessions of that nature would imperil the very existence of what is left of Ukraine, 80% or so. It's hard to see how the Ukrainians would agree to that. But for the time being, what the Trump administration has tried to do was to offer carrot after carrot, concession after concession to Russia, while they used many sticks against Ukraine. Despite all of this, Russia has not really said yes. So the Americans are facing a dilemma. It is also, unfortunately, the case that the Americans sent as their negotiator a real estate mogul from New York who may have been quite effective in reaching deals for real estate in New York, but this is international relations. It is a somewhat different kind of skill. And the Russians are sending their top negotiators, including Mr. Lavrov, who has decades of diplomatic experience. And so there's a kind of asymmetry in the negotiating skills of the negotiators that each side has sent. And also, there is a difference in goals. Mr. Trump wants to have a quick solution, and we still don't know what he means, that if there's not a quick solution, he will walk away from it.
So, Professor Braun, I want to ask you a little bit more about this thing that you've just outlined, the fact that the U.S. is up against a master tactician in Vladimir Putin, Steve Witkoff, who has been leading efforts, to mediate on the part of the United States, seen as perhaps not as, informed or smart about, about what's been happening in Ukraine. How concerned are you, that negotiations will lead to a further deterioration in the situation for Ukraine and Europe while giving Russia the upper hand?
There is a great deal to be concerned about, and yet there's a tremendous amount of irony. Collectively, NATO is vastly more powerful than Russia, which is, as I said repeatedly, was a remnant of the Soviet Union, a dangerous one, and certainly can do and is doing horrific damage to Ukraine, but it is no match for a mobilized NATO or a mobilized United States. But Mr. Trump seems to be driven by a kind of new 21st century form of isolationism, harking back to the 1930s, where he has been persuaded somehow that cutting deals with Russia, pulling back, perhaps even pulling out of NATO might be beneficial to the United States. This is viewed not only as misguided, but very dangerous by America's NATO allies, and there is no clear and consistent strategy on the part of Mr. Trump. Whereas the arc of foreign policy making tends to take years, under the second administration of Mr. Trump, this has been compressed to months, weeks, and at times days or hours. So there's that high level of unpredictability, which is not helpful in international relations. Consequently, we see a great deal of disarray in the NATO alliance. There's a summit coming up of the G7. This will be a difficult one because what the G7 countries will try to persuade the United States is that they need to remain in the alliance, they need to remain active, that an isolationist policy is not helpful for the democratic world and not helpful for the United States in particular.
So, Professor, given the current U.S. posture and Russian behavior, what kind of ceasefire, if any, could happen? Are we looking at a forced deal that trades peace for pieces of Ukraine, or like a Korean-style frozen conflict?
A ceasefire would make sense from a humanitarian perspective. The Trump administration keeps saying that Ukraine has not won the war, but neither has Russia. This is the fourth year. And Russia, which claims to have this enormous power, has not been able to win that war. They have lost huge numbers of troops, perhaps close to 1 million casualties, wounded and dead. Their economy has been militarized. They have become much more dependent on China. It would make a good deal of sense for Russia to reach that kind of agreement, keep a portion of Ukraine. But the danger is, from the Putin perspective, that if that should happen, then there are two particular elements that worry him. One is that Ukraine could then, with Western help, become a very successful democracy, the way South Korea has become. And that would be an example of a large Slavic state actually adopting democracy in a productive way and becoming an international competitor. Whereas Russia, despite its enormous wealth, isn't one, and it's increasingly a dictatorship. The second element that worries Mr. Putin is that he focuses on power, domestic power. He hasn't resolved the key problems, and therefore external adventures are a way to divert popular attention. If this war comes to an end, then he would have to focus on domestic issues, which he has neglected over the past quarter century. Russia should be in much better shape. The Russians should be far wealthier than they are. Russia should be a vastly more successful economy and international trading partner. It hasn't been that. It's largely an energy-based country, which is heavily militarized, but it is not enjoying the standard of living or the freedoms that its long-suffering people would deserve.
All right, Professor Braun, we do have to leave it there. As always, thank you for your valuable insights. We were speaking with Aurel Braun. He's Professor of International Relations at the University of Toronto and Center Associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard.